Today, in a striking rebuke to the Trump administration's handling of America's founding history, a federal judge has ordered the immediate restoration of historical materials documenting slavery at one of the nation's most significant presidential sites. The ruling, issued today on President's Day, centers on a bitter dispute over what truths Americans should be told about the country's origins. At the heart of this case is the President's House in Philadelphia, a site that few Americans may be familiar with, yet one that holds profound importance in our national story. This location served as the residence of both George Washington and John Adams during the formative years of the American presidency, long before the White House in Washington, D.C. was completed. Let me provide the essential context. During the 1790s, as the nation's permanent capital was under construction, both of America's first two presidents conducted the business of the executive branch from Philadelphia. George Washington lived in this house while serving as the nation's first president. John Adams, the second president, resided there as well before moving to the White House in November 1800, becoming the first president to occupy that now iconic residence. The Philadelphia house itself met an unfortunate fate. The last remaining walls of the structure were accidentally demolished in the 1950s. However, decades later, after archaeologists and historians definitively established the precise location of the original building, the city of Philadelphia acquired the land and undertook a preservation effort. Today, the site operates as a National Historic Site, an open-air pavilion where visitors can observe the foundation outlines of the original structure and view artifacts from the era when Washington and Adams lived and governed from that location. But this site tells more than just the story of presidential residency. It tells a more complete, more uncomfortable truth about America's founding. While John Adams, who hailed from Massachusetts, did not own slaves, George Washington most certainly did. Historical records document that Washington brought 8 enslaved individuals from Virginia to serve him at the Philadelphia residence during his presidency. He later brought a 9th enslaved person to the site, bringing the total to 9 human beings held in bondage while the nation's first president shaped the contours of American democracy from that very house. This historical reality, the presence of enslaved people at the President's House, has been part of the site's interpretive materials, part of the educational mission to present visitors with the full, complicated truth of America's founding era. That brings us to the controversy that erupted over the past year. President Donald Trump ordered the physical removal of all references to slaves and slavery from the National Historic Site. Every exhibit, every educational marker, every interpretive material that acknowledged the presence and reality of enslaved people at George Washington's Philadelphia residence, all of it was ordered stripped away. The city of Philadelphia challenged this action in federal court, and today that court delivered its verdict. Judge's ruling came from the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The presiding judge is a Republican appointee, nominated during the George W. Bush administration, a detail that underscores the nonpartisan nature of the legal principles at stake here. The judge opened her ruling with a literary reference that sets the tone for everything that follows, a quote from George Orwell's 1984. She then wrote, "As if the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984 now existed with its motto, 'Ignorance is strength,' this court is now asked to determine whether the federal government has the power it claims to dissemble and disassemble historic truths when it has some domain over historical sites." The judge's language throughout the ruling is both measured and devastating. She described the President's House site as representing Philadelphia's fulfillment of an obligation to tell the truth, the whole, complicated truth. In her assessment, the removal of what she termed crucial interpretive materials strips that site of truth itself and deprives the public of educational opportunities specifically designed to be free and accessible to all. In one particularly vivid passage, the judge compared the Trump administration's action to vandalism of the historical record itself. "The abrupt elimination of historically significant educational material at the site," she wrote, "is like pulling pages out of a history book with a razor." The implications, in the judge's view, are profound. She stated that each person who visits the President's house and does not learn of the realities of founding-era slavery receives a false account of this country's history. Moreover, she warned that the potential for the exhibits to be replaced by what she called an alternative script, which she deemed a plausible assumption, would represent an even more permanent rejection of the site's historical integrity. Such an outcome, she concluded, would be irreparable. On the question of irreparable harm, a key legal threshold for granting an injunction, the judge found that Philadelphia had met its burden. The Trump administration's defense was notably narrow. According to the ruling, the defendants raised only one argument for why an injunction would be inequitable. They claimed there is a public interest in upholding the federal government's right to convey its preferred speech. The judge rejected this argument decisively. She found that restoration of historical materials at the President's house does not infringe upon the government's free speech rights. Nor, she wrote, is the government prevented from conveying whatever message it wishes to send. But it cannot do so at the President's house, not by wiping away the history of the greatest founding father's management of persons he held in bondage. In a passage that acknowledges the full complexity of George Washington's legacy, the judge noted why his Philadelphia residence merits designation as a historic site in the first place. She wrote that Washington's house would not warrant such designation if Washington had not commanded the army that won the Revolutionary War. His presiding over the Constitutional Convention, she observed, graced that gathering with the gravitas and spirit necessary to the creation of the government's foundational document. Washington's restraint and modesty, in her words, radiated a strength and wisdom that defines the ideal of the chief executive to this day. But acknowledging Washington's monumental contributions to the nation's founding, the judge made clear, does not require erasing the uncomfortable truths about the enslaved people he owned. The government can convey a different message without restraint elsewhere, if it so pleases, she wrote, but it cannot do so at the President's house, not until it follows the law and consults with the city. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The motion for preliminary injunction will be granted. What this means in practical terms is immediate. The Trump administration is now under court order to restore the references to slavery and enslaved people at the President's House National Historic Site in Philadelphia. The interpretive materials that were removed must be returned. The educational exhibits that documented the presence of the 9 enslaved individuals who served George Washington at that location must be reinstalled. This ruling represents a significant check on executive power over the presentation of historical facts at federally connected sites. It establishes that the government's authority to control messaging at historic locations is not unlimited, particularly when those sites exist as part of agreements with local authorities, and when their fundamental purpose is educational and historical, rather than promotional. The case also raises broader questions about how America confronts its history. The dispute in Philadelphia is part of a larger national conversation about which aspects of the American story receive emphasis, which receive acknowledgement, and which face erasure. The judge's ruling makes clear that at sites dedicated to historical education, the answer cannot be selective omission of inconvenient truths. The Trump administration now faces a choice: comply with the court order and restore the historical materials, appeal the decision to a higher court, or pursue the consultation process with the city that the judge indicated might provide a lawful path forward for any future changes to the site's presentation. For now, on this President's Day, the court has sided with what the judge called the whole complicated truth, over what she characterized as a false and incomplete account of the nation's founding. The history of enslaved people at the President's house will return to public view. This is the story of a fight over memory, over education, and ultimately over who controls the narrative of America's origins. Today, at least in Philadelphia, a federal court has ruled that those seeking the full truth have the stronger claim.